They smashed her face off the stone and left the chest empty where a queen once sat. A single act that turned a ruler into a rumor. Who ordered the blows that would try to erase Hatshepsut from Egypt's memory? She had stood at the center of power. A woman who took the royal throne, wore the king's beard, raised 2 towering obelisks at Karnak, built the terraces of Deir el-Bahari, and sent ships to Punt for frankincense and myrrh. Yet later, her name was chiseled away, her likeness hacked, her cartouches scratched out. Why would a civilization destroy the evidence of its own ruler? The instrument of that erasure was not poetry but a chisel and a ledger. Stone inscriptions recarved, temple offerings reassigned, and priests who could omit her from rituals. Those who control the temple records control who counts as king, who stood to gain by turning a reigning monarch into a blank space. Historians once told a neat story of revenge, a son furious that a stepmother had ruled. The stones tell a different, harder story. Erasures happened over years, in fits, on specific monuments, sometimes leaving other reminders untouched. What do these patterns reveal about power, fear, and reputation in ancient Egypt? If you want to see how memory can be weaponized and how archaeology can fight back, follow the trail of broken statues, altered cartouches, and unexpected inscriptions. What will the damaged stone finally admit about the woman the state tried to forget? The chisel marks that gave it away. Across Deir el-Bahari and Karnak, someone methodically carved a pharaoh out of stone, chipping away names, faces, and cartouches from hundreds of monuments. Not in rage, but with bureaucratic precision. And this chapter opens inside that act of organized erasure to ask who was worth that much effort to unmake. On the broad terraces of Deir el-Bahari, the crisis was audible. The rhythmic ring of chisels against stone. A sound that turned carved flesh into blank plains and turned names into empty grooves. What those blows did was not random vandalism. They methodically removed a ruler from the visible record, scraping away cartouches, smoothing features, cutting names from temple walls and statues with the same careful hand used to finish a column. The central injustice is plain and unmistakable. A pharaoh who had ruled openly was being muted, erased from the monuments she built, as if authority could be unmade by changing what the gods and the living could read in stone. Who then could command that kind of quiet, persistent labor to unwrite a reign? Close inspection reveals the method. Cartouches, those ovals that encircle a royal name, were not smashed in fury. They were gouged out with regular, measured strokes until only a shallow scar remained. Faces were not only broken off and thrown aside, many were planed down, then recarved or left as anonymous heads. On a colonnaded wall a single scene survives, interrupted by a neat row of removed names, each erased at about the same depth and angle. Similar marks repeat in the precinct of Amun at Karnak. The same tool marks on obelisks and chapel walls. The same decision to remove the royal title rather than to collapse an entire relief. These are fingerprints of an organized campaign. What kind of authority issues orders that spare architecture while removing identity? The pattern points to administration, not mob violence. Teams of stonemasons on scaffolds could be directed to work systematically across building campaigns, guided by overseers who knew which inscriptions mattered and which could remain. The priesthood, the royal chancellery, or a new king's court could issue instructions, and skilled craftsmen would follow them because they were on the payroll, and because temple labor was already organized into crews and schedules. The work required patience and resources, portable workshops, steady wages, and access to temples and royal tombs. That level of coordination turns an act of erasure into a political instrument. Who, inside the corridors of power, decided the risks of leaving her memory intact were greater than the trouble of erasing it? Erasing a name in stone also reshaped how later generations read history. The absence itself became a message. Silence suggested illegitimacy to those who entered the temples after the chiselers had left. Yet the traces of removal, parallel grooves and unfinished cuts, give the modern eye a different testimony. They show intention and they show limits. The campaign could hide a cartouche but could not entirely hide the scale of investment in her building projects. Every smoothed face and every hollowed oval raises another question. What does it cost a state to unmake a ruler? And what does that cost tell us about the fragility of reputation and the power of memory? A name the stone was not supposed to forget. The thesis of the video is laid bare. Hatshepsut was not a regent who overstepped or a curiosity of gender confusion. She was a fully operational pharaoh who ruled Egypt for over 2 decades, built more than almost any king before her, and was then subjected to one of the most systematic campaigns of historical deletion ever carried out in the ancient world. The final carving was hacked away while the sun still warmed the limestone. A chisel struck a royal cartouche, and the name on the wall ceased to exist in the way the pharaoh intended. What followed was not a simple vandalism or a moment of petty spite. It was a systematic campaign that turned a living, visible reign into gaps on temple walls and blank spaces in official lists. Hatshepsut was not a placeholder ruler or an oddity of gender. She governed as pharaoh for more than 2 decades, commissioned a flurry of monuments, and then saw her image and name deliberately erased as if memory could be unmade by stone alone. Her authority is written into the architecture she left behind. The mortuary complex on the cliff, terraces, colonnades, and long-reliefed galleries, was conceived to read like a royal biography in stone. Obelisks that pierced the sky at Karnak were cut from single blocks and erected with inscriptions that announce royal acts. Reliefs record a sea voyage to Punt with exotic cargo and exotic peoples. They show ships, incense trees, and the logistics of long-distance trade. Statues portray a ruler wearing the ceremonial false beard and the kilt, seated on the throne with the full pharaonic titulary carved beneath. These are not the gestures of a regent waiting in the wings. These are the unmistakable marks of a fully operational king, claiming divine birth, directing expeditions, and building at a scale that outpaced many predecessors. The Erasure worked with tools and with official procedure. Names were chiseled from cartouches and replaced or left blank. Faces were hammered away at their noses and eyes. Entire statues were smashed or recut to show different kings. Where inscriptions once celebrated donations and festivals, later hands filed away signs and scratched out pronouns. On certain temple walls, Hatshepsut's cartouche was overcarved with another royal name. On others it was left as a pale oval, an absence that everyone seeing it would recognize. Some official king lists compiled by priests omit her entirely, a formal silence among otherwise continuous listings of rulers. This was not random damage. It was the careful removal of a public record, a mechanism of power that used the permanence of stone to try to rewrite the past. Who ordered it and why remains debated, but the method is clear. If you control the monuments, you control what later readers will know. Even emptied, those monuments argued back. Fragments preserved the Punt reliefs. Buried statues re-emerged with traces of the original inscriptions. Later scribes left inconsistencies that betray deliberate erasure. Modern excavation has had to read between chisel marks to reconstruct what was lost. The attempt to excise a name created its own breadcrumb trail. That survival raises the sharper question. What is the true reach of an act meant to erase a life? Can deliberate forgetting ever fully succeed? Or does the pattern of removal itself become part of the record, a louder kind of testimony? The bloodline that made her untouchable. Hatshepsut was the daughter of Thutmose I and his great royal wife Ahmose, making her the purest royal blood in the palace. And this chapter shows why in 18th dynasty Egypt, that pedigree was not decorative but structural, carrying theological weight that no man in the succession could match on his own. The palace swelled with tension the day the old king died, and the question of succession hung in the air like dust. Hatshepsut was not merely one claimant among many. She carried in her person a chain of relationships that the court and the priesthood read as law. She was the daughter of Thutmose I and his great royal wife Ahmose. That descent mattered not as a genealogical curiosity, but as a concentrated packet of right to rule. A pedigree that other men in the line could not reproduce by blood alone. Who could credibly challenge a woman whose very name spelled out both royal parentage and the sacral connection the cult demanded? Her claim was made visible and visceral in stone. In the mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, reliefs show the god Ammonius approaching Queen Ahmose, and the narrative gives Hatshepsut a divine origin. Ammonius fathers the future ruler in a scene that ties celestial will directly to her body. These are not private prayers but public scripts, carved into temple walls where priests read, and where rituals reenacted the story. That carving is not proof of a miracle. It is evidence of a deliberate political theology. If Ammonius is the father, No human rival can claim superior legitimacy. How did a carved narrative become stronger than military force or palace intrigue? The mechanism that turned blood into untouchability was institutional. The title of Great Royal Wife was not decorative. It concentrated ritual authority, access to priestly rights, and a role in royal genealogies. Hatshepsut held the titles King's Daughter, and later King's Wife, as she married a royal half-brother. She had the pedigree that fused reigning king, queen, and priesthood into one chain. Temples answered to Amun's priesthood, and the priesthood liked stability and gifts. She amplified that stability with public acts. Obelisks and endowments at Karnak, oblations that reinforced the god's favor and, by extension, her right. The question became practical. When theology, office, and wealth line up, who enforces a rival claim? Men who sat on the throne after her or alongside her did not simply lack ambition. Many lacked the same maternal credential. The typical male claimant could boast a father who was king, but his mother was often a secondary wife or a concubine. A distinction with real consequences in ritual law and public perception. The royal house had evolved mechanisms that made the maternal line a vector of sacred heredity. Men could be kings by force or succession, but they rarely inherited the bundled sacral legitimacy that came from being born of the great royal wife and acknowledged by Amun. Could a male king without that maternal sanction ever render Hatshepsut's claim null in the eyes of the gods and the priests? This combination, pure royal blood, priestly endorsement, and public ritual, created not just a political advantage, but a kind of structural immunity. Her pedigree was encoded into temples and titles that outlived daily palace politics, and those institutions were reluctant to undo a story that gave them standing and gifts. Myth and propaganda were different things here. The divine birth scene is mythic language, but the reliefs themselves are hard evidence of an organized strategy to make a woman's lineage function as law. If legitimacy could be manufactured by narrative and ritual, then what happens when later rulers try to unmake it? The architecture of the Egyptian throne. Before Hatshepsut's story can accelerate, the viewer must understand how pharaonic legitimacy actually worked, not through simple inheritance, but through a dense system of divine selection, ritual performance, Amun's endorsement, and a priesthood that could elevate or quietly destroy a claim to power. The court froze the moment the usual path to power snapped. A palace full of officials, soldiers and priests still expected a pharaoh to arrive with a god's nod, not a claim from a woman wearing a regent's sash. The central distortion that follows her life is simple. Later generations would remove her from monuments as if she had never held the crown. How could that rewriting happen so thoroughly when kingship was supposed to be a sacred chain of selection and ritual? Religious endorsement, not family blood, was the engine that turned someone into pharaoh. Amun mattered more than pedigree. Hatshepsut's most direct answer to that reality was a staged miracle. The carved divine birth scenes inside her mortuary temple that show Amun approaching her mother and pledging the child as the true heir. Those images are not neutral history. They are political theater in stone. Yet they also record what the court needed to show: the god's personal choice. That raises the question of weight. Was a carved god's voice as powerful as the live priests who spoke for him? Public ceremonies and the look of kingship translated the claim into daily reality. The crown, the false beard, the royal name written inside an oval, the obelisks that pierced the sky at Karnak. Each was a signal the populace and officials could read. Hatshepsut adopted male regalia and used monumental architecture to broadcast the message, even going so far as to set up twin obelisks at Amun's temple. Those objects and names were not mere decoration. They functioned as evidence in a world where proof came from ritual display. Still, who controlled those signs mattered as much as the signs themselves. That control lay in the hands of the temple and its priesthood. The priests of Amun ran the great sanctuaries, guarded oracles, held the lion's share of temple wealth, and performed the daily rites that made the god present. Their approval turned a carved birth scene into a living mandate. An oracle declared, a priest presented the god's favor, and the city accepted a ruler. Conversely, they could quietly strip those marks away. Stone was durable, but it could be cut. Names could be chiseled out and statues toppled. The violent, selective removals of her inscriptions and images show how the priesthood and later rulers could erase reputation almost as effectively as they had built it. If temples could make kings, could they not also unmake them? A marriage that was always a political equation. Her marriage to Thutmose II was not a love story and was never meant to be. It was a merger of two branches of royal blood, one with stronger divine legitimacy than the other, and the power imbalance inside that marriage would define everything that followed. The palace erupted into a different kind of silence when the king died, and the question of succession became a clock running out. Hatshepsut was not swept up in a romantic marriage. She was folded into a calculation meant to stop the court from tearing itself apart. The central historical wrong that follows her is that the record was later rewritten to make her seem an anomaly or an usurper, rather than the product of a deliberate royal solution to a dangerous succession. How did a union meant to settle a crisis become the seed of a long campaign to erase her? Concrete bloodlines explain the raw logic behind the match. She was born as a king's daughter by the principal queen. He was a king's son by a lesser wife. Their marriage stitched two branches of the royal family together. One branch carried the ceremonial and religious weight that marked a ruler as divinely legitimate. The other carried the practical claim of male descent that courtiers and soldiers expected. The wedding did not merge affection, it merged claims. What happens when a marriage designed to unify legitimacy instead concentrates rival sources of authority in one household? Once married, titles and ritual, not private intimacy, became the instruments of power. She took the traditional role of great royal wife and kept the visibility that came with it. Public appearances, priestly ceremonies, and the custody of royal children. He carried the crown in name, and yet his ability to project an unchallenged sovereign authority depended on the ritual backing she represented through her birth and her temple ties. The mechanism at work was not force but reputation. Who could be presented to the gods and the people as the true reservoir of kingship? How far can ritual and public image compensate for, or override, the simple fact of male succession? The imbalance inside the marriage shaped every next move. When the male line produced a son by a secondary wife, that child's existence transformed the marriage from an arranged piece into a political hazard. Hatshepsut could use temple narratives, monumental inscriptions, and the elevation of her daughter to consolidate her standing, and she did. She commissioned shrines and staged ceremonies that put her at the center of divine favor, even invoking a divine birth story to make the gods the authors of her rule. But each step she took to secure legitimacy also left new vulnerabilities. A throne bound to ritual could be unbound by a later, determined court. If ritual legitimacy could crown her, could the same court cut it away? The marriage that began as a merger left a dangerous inheritance. It provided a path for her ascent, and it left a rival line with its own claim and later motive to delegitimize her. The same family tie that gave Hatshepsut a place at the heart of power later supplied the reason for her erasure. Successors could portray her rise as an irregularity to be corrected. The political equation inside that marriage, bloodline against ceremonial authority, wife against secondary wives and their offspring, explains why a woman who ruled in plain daylight was reduced in memory to a problem to be solved. What then do the scars in stone and the gaps in the record tell us about who decided which stories of rulership were allowed to last? The pharaoh who died too soon. Thutmose II's reign was short and his health was fragile. And when he died, the heir to the throne, Thutmose III, was a child born to a secondary wife, leaving a vacuum of legitimacy so dangerous that the court had no choice but to place Hatshepsut at its center. The palace went silent when the king's health failed, and there was no grown hand ready to lift the scepter. Thutmose II had ruled too briefly and too weakly to shore up a clear, uncontested succession. The named heir, a boy with the name of Thutmose, was the child of a secondary wife, Iset, not of the great royal wife who stood at the center of court life. That combination, a fragile ruler, a premature death, and a child born to a lesser consort, turned what should have been a routine transfer of power into an open crisis. Egyptian kingship ran on pedigree and visible rank. A son born to the great royal wife carried immediate weight. A son of a lesser wife did not. Hatshepsut, however, already sat inside the key circles. She was the king's daughter and his principal royal partner. Those facts mattered in a system where marriage, lineage, and ritual office defined who could legitimately rule. The court could either accept a weak child backed by uncertain lineage, or place its trust in a senior royal woman whose status and relationships were known quantities. Which path would avoid civil fracturing and external opportunism? The mechanism the court chose was institutional and theatrical at once. Regency anchored in marriage ties and ritual legitimacy. Hatshepsut took on the regent's role, a position that gave her day-to-day control of administration, the treasury, and access to the temples. The priesthood of Amun and the palace bureaucracy were the levers that turned power into action. In the years that followed, the visual program at Deir el-Bahari and other monuments shows her not merely as guardian, but as ruler, adopting male regalia and kingly titulary. Yet the record also contains the trace of a cautious start. Early inscriptions present her authority in tandem with the child king's name, evidence of a staged transfer rather than an overnight usurpation. How far could ritual form and institutional authority be stretched before opponents called it illegitimate? That choice solved an immediate danger, but created a long-term question. Does survival through necessity become precedent? By centralizing power around Hatshepsut, the court rewired expectations about who could occupy the throne when normal succession failed. She used marriage, blood, priestly endorsement, and visible royal imagery to convert an emergency regency into durable rule. At the same time, the sideline child king lingered as the legal focal point of dynasty, a fact that later actors would exploit when they sought to restore a singular male line. The emergency decision that placed Hatshepsut at the heart of the court thus asks another question. Could a temporary political solution become a permanent redefinition of kingship without provoking a counterreaction? Regent is a word that means temporary. Hatshepsut was appointed regent for the boy king, a role Egypt understood as custodial, not sovereign. But this chapter traces the specific moments, titles, and ritual escalations through which she began shifting from guardian to something the system had not authorized. The palace convulsed when the king who had kept order died and the heir was still a child. Administrators, generals, and priests faced the real risk of chaos. In that emergency, a regent was an agreed fix. A caretaker who held power only until the boy could rule. What most later storytellers hid or twisted was simple and brutal. Hatshepsut was meant to be temporary, a guardian whose authority rested on the fragile assumption of return to normalcy. How does a moment meant to protect a dynasty become the doorway to permanent authority? Her first moves played within the expected rules. She already wore the visible marks of royal family. Daughter of a king, widow and great royal wife, figure at the heart of palace ritual. Those labels gave her legitimacy to act for the child. And the state accepted that a woman close to the throne could steward the royal household and its estates. Yet inscriptions and official records from the period show a steady shift in language. References that once emphasized guardianship began to sit beside formulas that treated her as active ruler. Which word or phrase, in those records, first tipped the balance from caretaker to claimant? Then came the unmistakable leap. She adopted the full public symbols of kingship. She took a throne name, Motker, and placed it in the same cartouches used by male pharaohs. Statues and reliefs began to show her in kingly dress, sometimes with a false beard and the male kilt, and official monuments put her name into temple annals and royal lists. These were not private choices. They were public performances designed to be seen by priests, generals, and foreign envoys. What happens to legitimacy when the signs that define it are simply adopted and amplified? Power consolidated through ritual and spectacle. Temples and the priesthood mattered most because they provided the sacred endorsement a pharaoh needed. Hatshepsut invested in temple construction, donated obelisks, and had scenes carved that told a new origin story, one in which the king god Amun selects or endorses her. Those images rewired what people were taught to accept at the most authoritative sites of public memory. Each foundation ceremony, each carved hymn, each visible gift to a god made an abstract claim into an embodied reality. Who within that network of priests, artisans, and officials chose to resist, and on what grounds? The change was cumulative and strategic. One title did not win a throne, 100 small escalations did. A regent who performed kingly rites, who assumed kingly names, and who filled temples with carved narratives left successors with a dilemma. accept a redefined rule, or erase the traces and restore the old grammar of power. The later campaign to chisel her images away is itself proof that her ascent was experienced by many as an overstep, not merely a successful transfer. Did she break the rules of a custodial system, or did she exploit a gap the system always left open? The day she put on the double crown. At some point between years 2 and 7 of Thutmose III's nominal reign, Hatshepsut formally declared herself pharaoh, not queen consort, not regent, not co-ruler in a lesser sense, but Matkar, the full embodiment of divine kingship. And this chapter reconstructs what that act required, who had to agree, and what it meant to every power center in Egypt. When the palace woke to the rumor that the woman who had been managing the kingdom for a boy king would step out of the shadows and take the double crown, the morning felt like a slow, sharp fracture. Courtiers whispered that the act would be irreversible. More than a costume change, it would remake who held law and force in Egypt. The central injustice that haunts her memory now is plain. Later generations carved her back into a footnote and called her a usurper. But the record she left shows something more complex. She did not snatch power by force alone. She seized the symbols and the consent that made a king legitimate. Then memory was rewritten to erase that consent. How did she make that consent happen? And who chose to stand with her when everything could have split? To put on the double crown she needed ritual, paperwork, and visible witnesses. The first requirement was the royal titulary, a throne name inside a cartouche, a prenomen and nomen that would be spoken and written in temples and on stelae. That change is visible on the stone of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, where she is named Matkar, and shown in scenes of divine birth. Second, the temples had to accept her as king. Acceptance here meant more than blessings. Priests at Karnak and other sanctuaries controlled the oracles, the festival routes, and the economy of cult. Third, the bureaucracy and military had to take oaths of service and receive clear orders in the king's name. Seals, decrees, and appointment stelae carried her cartouches and circulated the new reality down the Nile. Each of those steps left physical traces, reliefs, official inscriptions, statues, but also required people whose livelihoods and reputations were at stake. Who among them judged the risk worth taking? The priesthood of Ammonius was the single most decisive power center. Their approval turned a woman's claim into a god-sanctioned kingship. Hatshepsut's team crafted a public story. Ammonius had fathered the future king by concealing himself in the form of Thutmose II, and thus handing divine paternity to the new ruler. These scenes are carved into stone at her temple. A god embraces a royal mother. The baby is shown receiving royal insignia. The story is a theological bridge from God to throne. But the evidence shows it was not merely myth-making, it was politics. Ammonius priests controlled temples, land, and labor. By securing their formal endorsement, visible in temple ritual calendars, donations, and the placement of her images in sanctuaries, she neutralized the greatest institutional obstacle. Did those priests consent out of genuine belief, gratitude for temple gifts, political calculation, or fear of marginalization? The administrative state and military elements had their own calculus. High officials needed to know who would pay garrisons, approve irrigation projects, and sign grain distributions. Senenmut, her powerful steward and architect, is a concrete example. His name and titles appear beside hers on monuments. His career rose with hers. Appointments mattered. Promotions and lands were distributed, and building contracts in stone and quarry records gave work to networks of craftsmen and suppliers who then had a stake in continuity. The army, though not the political kingmaker in the same way as the priesthood, required explicit acknowledgement of command. Documents and reliefs show Hatshepsut issuing building orders, sending expeditions, and receiving tribute under her royal name. Those actions bound administrators and soldiers to recognize her. What bargains were struck in private corridors to secure that loyalty? Wearing the double crown itself was a visual act of conquest over symbols. The white hedget and the red dishret together signified rule over Upper and Lower Egypt. She adopted male dress, the false beard, and masculine epithets, but she also kept feminine forms in some inscriptions, a careful, tactical ambiguity. The double crown on temple walls announced to every nome and every caravan that the old order of authority now had a different face. Public festivals, especially the opet and the coronation rites reenacted in temples, placed her image before priests, nobles, and crowds. Her obelisks and shrines, erected in Karnak and on the West Bank, localized her kingship in stone, making denial costly. Yet how did ordinary people, the farmers, boatmen, market sellers, register this change when their daily obligations remained the same? What the act of coronation meant for each power center was different. For the priesthood it reinforced Ammonius' centrality and brought donations and a new royal builder. For the nobility and administrators it redistributed offices and wealth. For the military it clarified chains of command and campaign funding. For provincial governors it reasserted the capital's reach through new decrees and visible monuments. The end result was not a simple seizure but a negotiated remaking of authority through ritual endorsement, administrative integration, and visual domination. Yet the later campaigns to erase her name do more than punish a woman's ambition. They reveal which actors survived the bargains and chose to rewrite the story to protect their own legitimacy. Who profited most from erasing her? And what did that erasure hide about the compromises that made her rule possible? Why Ammonius said yes. Hatshepsut did not seize power through military force. She secured it through the most powerful institution in Egypt, the priesthood of Ammonius at Karnak. And this chapter explains the transactional relationship between the throne and the temple, showing how she funded, elevated, and embedded herself into the god's authority until her rule, and his will became indistinguishable. The moment the king died and a child nominally inherited the throne was more than a dynastic problem. It was an emergency for the institutions that held Egypt together. Hatshepsut stood at that hinge, officially regent for a boy, effectively put in charge of a state that could fracture if rival generals, nobles, or insider priests turned their faces away. Later historians tried to erase how she secured power, recasting her as a usurper or an oddity. The distortion misses the single, decisive deal that made her more than temporary manager. She bought the priesthood's public voice and made it hers. How does a woman turn the mouth of a god into an endorsement for a crown? She began by converting spectacle into legal cover. At Karnak she set up visible, immovable claims. 2 enormous obelisks raised on the temple platform, a bark shrine known now as the Red Chapel, countless statues and reliefs that tied her image into Ammonius' own precinct. In stone and in ceremony she paid for the right to be pictured as Ammonius' chosen. Sophisticated gifts followed the pageantry. The expedition to Punt returned not only with exotic goods but with commodities, incense, myrrh, exotic woods and gold, that fed the temple's rituals and coffers. Temple inscriptions cataloged donations of land, cattle and precious metal. The estate lists and donation stelae that survive are not prayers, they are contracts. Who kept the keys to the state treasury, and what would they demand for their blessing? Ritual endorsement is not vague theology. It is a public, repeatable performance that reads like a verdict. Priests of Ammonius pronounced her divine birth in elaborate inscriptions. Ammonius receives the queen in secret, later approaches and impregnates her, and the god himself is shown placing the royal regalia on her head. Those are mythic images, but they were deployed inside the temple's daily liturgy, visible to thousands during festivals, inscribed where solemn oaths and legal texts were archived. The high priest, men such as Hatshepsut and influential officials like Senenmut, did more than bless. They staged ceremonies in which Ammonius' bark moved through Thebes with Hatshepsut's name and image on display. The question becomes practical. What power did the priesthood gain by declaring the god's will? The answer lies in resources, appointments and prestige. That exchange was transactional, woven into the economy of cult. Temples controlled vast tracts of land, laborers, grain stores and administrative networks. Hatshepsut increased those holdings with targeted endowments, and in turn used temple personnel to carry out state rituals, and to write the official story of her rule. She placed trusted men into temple offices and financed building campaigns that provided work and regular supplies for the priests. The temple got wealth and stability, she got sacral validation. This is why later campaigns to erase her were complicated. Stone can be chiseled, faces hacked away, but the temple archives, the endowment lists, the very rhythm of festival calendars, those are harder to unmake. If the god had spoken, then many of the instruments of state recorded that speech. So why did successors still move to obliterate her image when her legitimacy was buried in the temples themselves? That contradiction is the next mystery to follow. The invention of a divine birth. On the walls of Deir el-Bahari, Hatshepsut commissioned an elaborate visual narrative showing the god Ammonius visiting her mother in the form of Thutmose I, conceiving Hatshepsut as a divine child destined to rule. A piece of theological propaganda so bold it had no real precedent. And this chapter dissects it as a calculated political instrument, not a myth she believed. When the court whispered that a woman could not inherit the throne, the crisis was immediate and existential. Hatshepsut stood between the established law of male succession and the raw need to hold power. Defeat would mean exile from authority and erasure from public memory. The distortion that followed, portraying her as a miraculous child of Ammonius, was not an innocent story. It was a direct answer to a political emergency. She needed an unassailable origin that outmaneuvered rivals and neutralized questions about her right to rule. On the colonnaded terraces of her mortuary complex at Deir el-Bahari, reliefs were cut with surgical precision. In the panels, a god approaches a royal woman. Words carved beside the scene explain that Ammonius, the king of the gods, assumed the likeness of Thutmose I to enter the queen's bedchamber. Priests and midwives appear as witnesses in the registers, and the child is presented to gods and courtiers alike. The imagery is layered. Ammonius features Thutmose I's regalia, the queen's royal insignia, each element selected to bridge divine will and dynastic continuity. The visual vocabulary is arresting because it makes a political claim look like sacred history. That closeness between temple art and political need is the mechanism of power at work. Hatshepsut did not simply assert descent from a god. She staged a theological act that rewrote lineage in stone. Placement mattered. These reliefs sat in a temple complex visited by priests, officials, foreign envoys, and the populace who came to see rituals of Ammonius. The narrative was therefore repeated visually every time the precinct filled with people. Priests who managed the cult of Ammonius gained from the spectacle. Their authority was reinforced by the very story that elevated Hatshepsut. So the divine birth functioned as a tool. It manufactured sacred consent, folded religious authority into royal legitimacy, and made opposition risky because it would appear to contest the gods themselves. Was the message aimed at persuading simple believers? Certainly. But its deeper aim was political, to neutralize rivals and make rule seem inevitable. The archaeological traces separate performance from private belief. The carved texts speak in the language of ritual proclamation, not intimate confession. Later attempts to chisel away her images and erase her cartouches show that the claim was perceived as dangerous by successors. If it had been only sincere piety, why worry so much? The violence of the erasures tells a different story. The divine birth had worked well enough to become a liability for those who followed, who could not tolerate a precedent of a woman sanctified to sit on the throne. So the evidence points to deliberate invention, co-created with powerful temple institutions. How durable is a legitimacy built on stage theology? That is the question Hatshepsut's enemies tried to answer with hammers and chisels. The beard, the titles, and the masculine mask. Hatshepsut began appearing in statues and reliefs as a male pharaoh, with a false beard, male body, and masculine titles. And this chapter explains that this was not confusion or costume, but the only available visual grammar for legitimate kingship, forcing her to inhabit a form that would later be used to mock, misunderstand, or pathologize her. She stood between two carved pillars, the carved face of the god looking down. And every single image that day could decide whether her rule would be remembered as lawful or as a scandal. The crisis was simple. The rules of kingship were written in stone and paint, and the rulebook assumed a man. The central injustice is clear. When Hatshepsut assumed the throne, she was forced into a visual code that erased the visible fact of her womanhood, and later generations would treat those very images as evidence that she had somehow disguised or warped nature. How did representation become a trap, and who wrote the rules she had to obey? The visual language of pharaonic power left little room for negotiation. A king wore a particular set of signs: the Nemes headcloth or double crown, the shendik kilt, the broad-shouldered musculature and sculpture, and above all the false beard, a small plaited or straight beard strapped under the chin. These were not fashion choices. They were shorthand for divine and legal authority. The beard linked the ruler to the god-king tradition. The royal titulary and cartouches declared office and relationship to the gods. Hatshepsut adopted the full royal titulary, including a throne name that placed her in that line. She had statues carved with the beard attached, and reliefs cut to show the square-jawed form of a king. This was not theatrical costume or simple confusion. It was the only visual grammar available to claim the power that belonged, by convention, to a male figure. If she did not speak that visual language, her claim would be unreadable. What does it mean to take on a body that is not your own simply to be legible as legitimate? Look closely at the surviving statues and reliefs, and the story becomes more complicated. In some works, early images preserve feminine features, rounded face, softer contours, while the garments and beard remain strictly male. In other pieces she is rendered with a fully masculinized body. Those shifts track a strategic use of signs. Where a softer image could placate audiences, it was used. Where the throne needed the unambiguous authority of the king, the masculine mask appears without compromise. This shows a mechanism of power through visual codes. The state did not accept alternative symbols of rulership, and images were not optional ornaments but instruments of governance. How did viewers at the time reconcile the mismatch between body and office, when every public monument declared the same law? The masculine mask also shaped how memory and rumor would treat her later. Because she inhabited the king's iconography, later historians and officials could point to the beard and male titles, and say she had somehow overreached, or that her reign was an anomaly to be corrected. The very garments that secured her rule provided the easiest proof tokens for successors who wanted to discredit or erase her. Remove or deface the signs, and the claim collapses for later audiences who read pictures before they read records. This is not simply a story of personal vanity or gender confusion. It is a story about who gets to define a legitimate body for power, and how that definition can be weaponized afterward. If the only available script for rulership required a man's outline, what choices did a woman with power really have? Separating mythology from evidence matters here. The myth that she pretended to be a man for personal ambition ignores the archival fact that the king's regalia carried legal force. Contemporary inscriptions present her with kingly titles. Monuments show the beard and regalia. Priests and officials performed rituals addressed to the kingly person she inhabited. Yet centuries later, narrative and damage turned those same marks into proof that she was an aberration. The consequential question remains: did the masculine mask protect her claim at the cost of inviting posthumous delegitimization? Or was it the only way to make her rule count at all? Senenmut, the man they used against her. Senenmut was her chief steward, architect, advisor, and the tutor of her daughter Neferor. And for centuries, historians and gossips have reduced him to a rumored lover, using the relationship to imply that a woman in power must have had a man behind her, when the evidence shows something far more interesting. A political alliance built on competence and mutual dependency. The first chisel cut into the stone beside her, and a crafted life began to disappear. For centuries that missing stone became a story easier to tell than the one the records actually hold. Instead of a capable administrator, Senenmut was turned into a scandalous footnote. A rumored lover, the man who supposedly stood behind a woman who should not have ruled. That distortion did a simple job. It rewrote an alliance of work and authority as a private scandal, and in doing so it emptied Hatshepsut's public achievement of its political content. Why was the operative truth replaced by a gossip that explained nothing? Senenmut's presence in the record is practical and repetitive, not romantic. He carried the titles of chief steward and overseer of royal works. He ran the household that supported the royal family. He organized quarrying, transport, and the labor that built temples and obelisks. He was named tutor of Neferor, the royal child. Surviving wall scenes and inscriptions show him directing work crews, signing accounts, and appearing at ritual moments beside the queen and the princess. Those are not the gestures of a lover's private life. They are the fingerprints of a manager who controlled tasks as small as provisioning, and as large as the staging of royal ideology. How do you turn administrative muscle into scandal? By refusing to read the paperwork. The physical traces underline a political partnership. He had his own carved chapels and a tomb cut into the same cliff face that holds the queen's greatest monument. One place contains images of Neferur with a man who instructs and stands watch. Another ceiling preserves star charts and personal scenes that reinforce a civic role. Architect, steward, guardian of ritual order. Whoever organized stone from the quarry to the temple coordinated thousands of people and enormous flows of wealth. That level of responsibility made Senenmut indispensable. Hatshepsut needed someone who could translate her decisions into stone and supply. Senenmut needed royal favor and the security that came with proximity to the throne. What happens when competence becomes the basis of power? The rumor about a sexual relationship answered the wrong question. It suggested a simple formula: woman in power, man behind her, and shut down inquiry into how memory itself is weaponized. When later authorities sought to recast Hatshepsut's legacy, they attacked images, cut names, and let rumor do the rest. It is striking that the documentary record contains no explicit confirmation of the intimate affair that gossip later insisted upon. Instead, we have repeated attestations of office, accounts of building works, and the rare intimacy of a tutor's role with the princess. Those are the durable pieces. Why, then, did the slander stick more tenaciously than the invoices and the building logs? Reading Senenmut as a political partner changes the texture of power in that court. It shifts attention from private temptation to administrative dependency. The drafting of edicts, the movement of stone, the placement of sculptures that announce legitimacy. It explains why his image appears where it does, why his responsibilities mattered to the queen's public project, and why his rise was both bold and dangerous. The central question left is not whether tales of romance circulated, but why a society, and later historians, preferred rumor over the visible machinery of rule. Deir el-Bahari. A monument that was meant to outlast doubt. Hatshepsut's mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari was not merely beautiful. It was an argument in stone, designed to make her reign permanent in the landscape, embed her in the cycle of divine kingship, and ensure that no successor could govern Egypt without literally walking past the proof of her rule. When the chisels came for her name, the landscape itself had to answer. Successors had already started to chip away faces and cartouches in temples. A slow legalistic violence that pretended to make a ruler disappear. Hatshepsut could be stripped of titles and images, but she responded by building a place that would hold its own testimony even if individual sculptures were smashed. The cliff at Deir el-Bahari became more than a backdrop. It was a courtroom and a witness. The temple climbs the rock in 3 broad terraces linked by ramps and framed by colonnades. Walkways force the eye up toward the stone cliff where chambers and sanctuaries are set like sockets in a jaw. Inside those colonnades are reliefs that lay out an argument. Scenes of a god presenting birth, a narrated expedition to Punt, offerings presented to Amun. Each image named and captioned in the same royal titulary that appears on her statues. The chapel of Hathor is hollowed directly into the rock with cow-headed capitals marking the goddess's presence. The design makes the story unavoidable. Who could pass along that axis without reading the claim that this woman belonged to the order of kings? Ritual is built into the architecture. The approach is a procession in stone. First the terraces with public-facing images, then narrower corridors leading toward inner sanctuaries that belong to the god and to the mortuary cult. The colossi, some posed as a conventional male pharaoh and some kneeling with offerings, were not simply statues. They stood where officials, priests, and foreign delegations would pause and perform obligations. The reliefs of the Punt voyage, with its frank botanical and trading detail, reinforced her role as a provider for Egypt's gods and people. This was memory engineered, so that ceremonies would keep repeating the story. Could a ruler who wanted to forget her do so without cutting off the route of worship itself? Later attempts to erase her leave a paradox. Faces hacked, names erased, yet the temple as a whole could not be moved. The terraces still faced the valley and the Nile. The ramps still guide the body and the eye. Successors could damage, but they could not recite the cliff or halt the seasonal movements of priests and pilgrims who were tied to the landscape and its rituals. Archaeologists today find fragments that show where chisels fell, and also the intact sequences that were meant to outlast a single reign. If memory can be attacked piece by piece, what happens when the stage for that memory stays standing for centuries? The expedition to Punt. wealth as proof of divine favor. Hatshepsut organized a massive trading expedition to the land of Punt, bringing back myrrh trees, gold, ivory, and exotic goods, and she made sure every detail was carved into temple walls, because in Egypt, prosperity was not just economics but theological evidence that the gods endorsed your reign. Her throne hung on a single fragile thing, proof. When rivals could point to tradition and male lineage, Hatshepsut needed an unmistakable, public demonstration that the gods had chosen her to rule. The expedition to Punt answered that need with spectacle and logistics, and then she carved every inch of it into stone so the story could not be denied. At Deir el-Bahari, the temple walls become a ledger of movement. The reliefs show seagoing vessels packed with goods and people, sailors with oars, and men carefully handling living myrrh trees whose roots are wrapped for transport. The ships head toward a place the Egyptians called Punt, a region most scholars place along the Red Sea coast of Africa. Hatshepsut's inscriptions and images list what came back: myrrh trees and aromatic gums, long pieces of ebony, ivory, gold, and animals and servants described as exotic. The scenes are precise: men carrying crates, priests receiving freight, and the Puntite ruler and his entourage presented as witnesses. These are not vague boasts. They are detailed records of cargo, ceremony, and transaction. She did not present those goods as mere trophies. The temple reliefs stage each item being offered to Amun and to the state, making prosperity into spiritual testimony. There are images of priests accepting myrrh and incense for the god, and of Hatshepsut standing before divine symbols while the products of Punt are shown in procession toward the sanctuary. In an Egyptian mind shaped by ritual, a wealthy harvest or a successful trade mission was evidence that the gods approved the pharaoh's rule. By placing the expedition in ritual context, by carving the routes, the crates, the faces of Punt and Egyptian alike, Hatshepsut turned commerce into theology. A delivered cargo became a divine endorsement etched in stone. The reliefs mix careful reporting with rehearsed imagery, and here myth and evidence must be kept apart. The Punt scenes are crafted to impress, with idealized portraits of foreign lands and staged meetings, but they correspond to concrete details. The unusual trees planted in the temple garden, the ship types, the catalog of goods, that an observer could check against what was actually brought back. Later generations could not simply call it a fable without also confronting the temple itself. Yet that raises a sharper question. If stone could make prosperity incontrovertible, why did later hands carve away her name and reshape her likeness? The very mechanism she used to lock her legitimacy into the world, public monuments, ritual presentation, and visible gifts to the god, proved both powerful and vulnerable to those who would rewrite history. What remains at Deir el-Bahari forces another challenge. The expedition's visual record shows the scale of state coordination, shipwrights, crews, storehouses, priests, and it shows how Hatshepsut mobilized the machinery of the state to prove divine favor. But the attempt to turn material abundance into theological proof prompts a deeper question about authority. Can the appearance of God-given prosperity ever outlast political enemies who control the narrative? Stone records a voyage. Stone can be defaced. The Punt expedition gave Hatshepsut a plausible, hard-edged case for divine endorsement. Yet the later erasure of her name asks whether carved prosperity is a permanent verdict, or simply one piece in a contest for memory and power. 20 years of stability they refused to call greatness. Under Hatshepsut, Egypt experienced 2 decades of architectural expansion, trade growth, temple construction, and internal stability. Achievements that in any male pharaoh would be called a golden age, but in her case were later compressed into a footnote or attributed to the officials around her. The moment the chisels hit marble and granite, something irreversible happened. A visible reign began to vanish. What survived were blanked cartouches and hacked faces, not the story of 2 decades when the kingdom grew steadier and richer. The central injustice is simple and brutal. A woman's long record of expansion and order was folded into a footnote, reassigned to ministers, or wiped away so later rulers could pretend the credit had always been theirs. Tangible proof of that prosperity is everywhere she left her mark. A monumental terrace carved into the cliff face rose with long colonnades and scenes of exotic ships. The reliefs show men and animals brought back from distant shores, crates of incense and fragrant resins, ebony, ivory and other luxury goods stacked beside sailors. Two towering obelisks were set up at the Great Temple complex as bold statements of royal will. One still looms where crowds can see it, the other lies broken where it fell. Temples were repaired and new chapels opened across the south and along key trade routes. These were not small maintenance jobs. Quarrying and transporting stone, hiring specialized artisans, organizing fleets for long seaborne voyages. Each project required a central authority to sign off and keep the money flowing. Who authorized the crews, paid the craftsmen, and issued the imperial seals stamped on these monuments? The answer was written in stone before it was erased. The way her reputation was stripped away shows the power of memory as a political tool. Erasures were not random vandalism. They were deliberate, bureaucratic acts. Names were chiseled out, faces smoothed, and new inscriptions carved where her cartouche once stood. Temple priests and royal scribes controlled access to archives and could compose king lists that omitted troublemakers. Senior officials who had run the daily work, overseers of the treasury, chief architects, stewards, were convenient repositories for credit. The chief steward's buildings and inscriptions remain, and because his name was left intact on some reliefs, later generations could point to him and say, he did it. That reassignment did more than flatter the bureaucracy. It rewrote the meaning of rulership. But why would a state erase its own visible successes instead of celebrating them? Stability itself became suspect after her death. There are no grand accounts of foreign conquest tied to her name. Yet the domestic economy was clearly buoyant. Temples received lavish endowments, craftsmen signed off on complex stonework, and trade caravans returned with rare goods that funded new shrines and offerings. She adopted traditional male regalia in official imagery, a ceremonial beard and the kilt of kings, not as artifice alone but as political strategy to show continuity and claim authority. Still, that very strategy may have made her a target later on. If male-looking images could be reinterpreted, then the rulers who followed could both use and unmake her legacy. Who benefits when the symbol of authority is suddenly ambiguous? Today the scratched stone tells a thriller's truth. Beneath the later hack marks are original reliefs that align deeds with her name. Archaeologists follow tool marks and palimpsests of mortar to recover sequences of construction and command. The myth that she was merely a placeholder or a puppet crumbles when those layers are read. The projects continued, the same workforce and plans, the same inscriptions of offerings and dedications. But recovering facts from altered stone raises a final, sharper question. When power can rewrite the visible record, how much of leadership itself becomes a matter of who survives the chisels? The boy king grows into a general. While Hatshepsut governed, Thutmose III was not locked in a dungeon. He was being trained in the military, growing into one of Egypt's most formidable future conquerors. And this chapter examines the strange, suspended coexistence between a ruling queen pharaoh and a co-regent who was legally king but functionally waiting. A night of knives and dynastic panic left the palace not with blood in the halls, but with a dangerous silence. A child sat on the throne while a woman in royal linen put on the full trappings of kingship. That crisis, an unexpected transfer of power, created an immediate problem of legitimacy. The central injustice that followed was not only the later campaign of erasure against the woman who ruled, but the persistent, mistaken story that the young man who was legally king spent his youth in chains or a cell. The records do not support that image. Instead, the boy king was sent into the world of arms and command, and that choice both contained and empowered him. How could a decision that looked like sidelining actually manufacture a future conqueror? Contemporary monuments and later records make clear he was groomed for war. Where some later voices imagined imprisonment, the evidence points to apprenticeship. He appears in contexts associated with military life, and when he finally takes the field his skill with chariotry and archery is the stuff of official praise. That training was practical and relentless. Officers taught discipline, drill, the handling of horses, the coordination of infantry and chariots. The young king learned to read terrain, and to move logistics as much as to pull a bow. Each lesson imparted a different kind of power. Command over men, over movement, and over the calculation of risk. But who decided that this was the safest place for him? A school of command or a gilded cage? Power here operated by exclusion. Removing him from the administrative heart of rulership while placing him at the center of military preparation. It was a single, focused mechanism. By keeping civil authority concentrated in the hands of the Queen Pharaoh, the court preserved continuity and public ritual. By investing the heir with military expertise, it kept him visible, useful, and ultimately dangerous in a controlled setting. This was not just training, it was social engineering. Young officers and captains who served him became part of his patronage network. Skills and loyalties gathered quietly. Did those same networks later make it possible for him to assert full command in a way the court could not contain? Later attempts to rewrite the past, chiseling names from statues, erasing cartouches, created the false impression that Hatshepsut crushed him. But a close look at campaign inscriptions, and the way later scribes lauded his victories, shows continuity from apprenticeship to command. The suspense between them was not merely personal rancor. It was a suspended political arrangement that incubated a future military strategy inside the frame of a suspended kingship. The crucial question then becomes, when the moment for full power arrived, was it a sudden overthrow or the predictable culmination of deliberate preparation? The moment she became a problem that could not be solved while she lived. As Thutmose III matured into adulthood with command of the army, Hatshepsut's position shifted from stabilizing force to structural obstacle. She could not be removed. She could not be delegitimized while Ammonius priests supported her. And she could not be killed without theological catastrophe, creating a political paralysis this chapter reconstructs in detail. When Thutmose III first rode out in command of the army, the balance that had kept the kingdom stable snapped into something sharper and more dangerous. Hatshepsut had been the axis around which the court turned. She acted as regent, took on royal titulary and male regalia, and oversaw massive building works that kept priests and officials invested. That pattern worked while the boy king was a child, but a grown commander with troops at his back is a different problem entirely. How do you keep a throne intact when the legal heir now walks among the officers and can claim the loyalty of the men who enforce power? The priesthood of Ammonius was the single concrete mechanism that made Hatshepsut untouchable. She did not merely rely on Ammonius' favor. She institutionalized it. Temple inscriptions promoted a story in which Ammonius fathered her. A narrative the priests propagated through ritual, donations, and newly commissioned sanctuaries. Those priests controlled enormous temple wealth, the rites that sustained royal legitimacy, and the daily liturgies that presented a living king to the people. Remove Hatshepsut and you risked alienating the priesthood, cutting off both the ritual sanction and economic underpinning of the state. Could any faction in the court realistically confront that power without triggering a religious rupture that would leave the throne illegitimate in the eyes of the populace? Military loyalty added a second, clashing pressure. Command of the army meant more than battlefield skill. It meant the practical ability to seize and hold the instruments of control. Thutmose III, maturing into that role, carried potential force into the center of politics. Hatshepsut could not purge him without risking a civil break with those officers. She could not simply strip him of rank, because such an act would delegitimize the military hierarchy. At the same time, the army depended on official sanction from the temples, salaries, supplies, and the symbolic backing provided by Ammonius' cult. Who would side with the generals if priests and king were at odds? Could either side risk open conflict when both stood to lose the appearance of divine order? The everyday machinery of government revealed the paralysis in practical terms. Grand projects continued. Obelisks went up, temples were endowed, and official decrees kept the bureaucracy functional. Yet behind those headlines the court was frozen on succession. Promotions and appointments became political landmines. Officials like Senenmut, whose career visibly tied him to Hatshepsut's patronage, embodied the dilemma. His monuments show a court that presented two centers of authority simultaneously, and their later partial erasure testifies to how perilously personal loyalty could be judged after the fact. If you could not kill the ruler without theological catastrophe, and you could not unmake her as long as the priests stood firm, then what instruments remained for a rival to assert authority without destroying the state? The impasse forced a narrow set of options that carried their own risks. A negotiated accommodation would leave the heir permanently sidelined. A covert campaign to delegitimize her would have to bypass the priesthood's narrative. A forced removal could tear through the religious fabric that bound king and land. None were clean. The question that follows from this paralysis is stark. When removing her was both sacrilege and political suicide, how did the kingdom eventually resolve the contradiction between ritual legitimacy and military command without collapsing into open conflict? Year 22. A death without a war. Hatshepsut disappeared from the record around year 22 of Thutmose III's reign, and no document records a coup, an assassination, a trial, or a revolt. She simply ceased, and this chapter examines what that silence means, what theories exist, and why the absence of drama may itself be the most unsettling part. The last official inscription that names Hatshepsut as ruler stops abruptly at Thutmose III's regnal year 22. For the Egyptian bureaucracy, that is a cliff. One moment her cartouche sits in stone beside royal decrees and building accounts, and the next it is gone. The central injustice is not that she failed as a ruler, but that later hands took it upon themselves to make her failure look like non-existence. Concrete traces remain. The great terraces of Deir el-Bahari, the obelisks she raised at Karnak, statues with their faces smashed, and yet the written record keeps a hole where a queen-king once stood. That hole forces historians to ask whether what we call disappearance is really death, erasure, retreat, or some combination of quiet political calculation. No ancient chronicle records a coup, no trial roll survives, no oath of vengeance was carved into a stela. That silence is itself a piece of evidence. Specialists have offered a handful of plain mechanisms to explain it. Sudden illness and natural death, an orderly transfer of authority back to Thutmose III, or a later campaign to purge royal memory by chiseling out her name. Administrative documents after year 22 show Thutmose III acting alone. Temple inscriptions show a woman's royal images later altered. Yet none of those documents says, Hatshepsut removed. Instead, we piece together the courtroom by the footprints left in the dust. Inscriptions stopped mentioning her. Officials who had flourished under her, like Senenmut, whose lavish tomb and many inscriptions once linked him to her, vanish or are altered in the archaeological record. Which leads to the question, does the absence of a dramatic statement mean there was no dramatic event, or that the drama was carefully left unrecorded? The most revealing single mechanism is the control of monumental memory. Whoever held the chisels could claim a different past. Look at the pattern. Hatshepsut's cartouches and royal epithets were systematically removed from temples and statues across Thebes and beyond, but often not immediately. Faces were broken. Names were cut out and sometimes later smoothed over. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari was left standing and largely intact structurally, while its inscriptions were defaced. That uneven treatment suggests a bureaucratic, staged campaign rather than a single furious night of iconoclasm. It also shows how power can be exercised after a ruler's death. Control the temples, control the memory. But who organized that campaign, and when exactly did it start? Was it the immediate successor reasserting masculine kingship, or a later generation reworking history for their own legitimacy? The strangest and most unsettling truth is this. The lack of a recorded struggle transforms the act of forgetting into the most effective weapon. Erasure by degrees. A chiseled cartouche here, a smashed statue there, a silence in the king lists, produces uncertainty. Myths of assassination or violent overthrow fill the gaps because people want drama. Yet the archaeological record prefers slow, bureaucratic erasure. That raises a final question that cuts across archaeology and politics. If power can remove a ruler from the public record without battle or proclamation, what then is left for historians to trust? Carved stone, official lists, or the cautious reading between them? The conqueror steps over her grave. Almost immediately after Hatshepsut's death, Thutmose III launched a series of military campaigns that would make him the most expansionist pharaoh in Egyptian history. And this chapter argues that the speed and scale of his pivot was not coincidence, but a deliberate effort to redefine Egyptian kingship as martial, outward, and male in direct contrast to everything she represented. Troops poured out of the Nile Valley and did not come back the same. The army that left Egypt under Thutmose III returned with lists of captured towns, detailed accounts of sieges carved into temple walls, and a new public image of what a pharaoh must be. A warrior at the head of a spear, not a builder at the head of a temple. Hatshepsut's reign had been visible everywhere. Luxury caravans, peaceful temple dedications, her mortuary temple rising from the cliffs of Deir el-Bahari. And then almost overnight, the state began amplifying another story. Why the hurry to replace one public identity with another? The rewriting worked through spectacle, not theory. Victory lists and campaign narratives were carved on the most sacred stones at Karnak, and in open courts where priests and officials passed every day. There are long, formal records, annals, that enumerate towns and tribute, and that frame the king as the bringer of order through force. Close by, images of a ruler smiting foes, helmeted and striding over the bodies of enemies, multiplied. Those images are literal political language. They teach the priests, soldiers, and foreign envoys who the rightful ruler is. By emphasizing military conquest in the spaces of religion and state ritual, Thutmose III reset the grammar of kingship toward the outward and the martial. What did those relentless, public records do to Hatshepsut's memory? Erasure was practical work carried out with chisels. Sculptors and stonecutters removed cartouches, hacked away faces and recarved reliefs. Plaster repairs and later restorations show the scratches and fresh fills. At the same sites where victories were announced, her name and likeness were often cut down or replaced with other royal names. That is not an accident of time, it is the same set of monuments being edited. Meanwhile, the state's bureaucrats and temple scribes emphasized the campaigns in yearly festivals and ritual calendars, ensuring the new narrative would be repeated in official rites. Who, then, decided that the ruler who wins on the battlefield is the only rightful ruler in the eyes of the gods and the state. Fear and reputation were central to the shift. Egyptian kingship tied divine favor to success in foreign lands. A ruler who failed to defeat enemies could be read as abandoned by the gods. Hatshepsut's long, prosperous domestic projects, trade fleets, building programs, peaceful administration, did not produce battle scenes to broadcast divine backing through domination. Thutmose III's campaigns delivered what the court needed. Visible, repeatable proof that the king was favored in the cosmic struggle against chaos. That changed expectations for successors and made the feminine, ceremonial model of authority politically vulnerable. Did the rapid swing to conquest reflect insecurity about precedent, or a calculated bid to close the door on female rulership? The aftermath reads like a campaign of memory as much as a sequence of battles. The inscriptions of triumph, the altered statues, the repurposed temple spaces. All these were tools in a concentrated effort to recast royalty as exclusively male and militarized. Yet traces of what was erased remained, buried in palimpsests of stone and text. Those hidden scratches became the clues later generations would follow. What other choices were made in the shadow of that pivot? And what further secrets still lie under the stone where the conqueror stepped over her grave? When the hammers came, years after her death, possibly decades, a coordinated campaign began to erase Hatshepsut from the monumental record. Her cartouches were chiseled out, her statues were smashed and buried, her images were replaced with those of Thutmose I or II, and this chapter walks through the physical evidence of that destruction with forensic precision. A battered statue lay in the courtyard of the mortuary temple, its jaw broken away and the royal cartouche on its chest scraped flat. The blow was not random. Tool marks ringed the carved name like a signature. The strikes were controlled, deliberate, aimed at identity rather than form. Across the temple walls the same pattern appears. Names and cartouches gouged out while the surrounding scenes remain. The chisels often cutting only one or two shallow lines until the foreign letters could no longer be read. That targeted removal is the first hard fact. Hatshepsut was not merely dethroned in words. Her name was systematically pried from the stone. Close inspection moves from drama to method. On many damaged blocks you can see repeated pecking from rounded hammerstones where craftsmen once pounded away the inner curves of hieroglyphs, then cleaner, flat chisel strokes that smoothed the glyph into nothing. In some cases faces were smashed by vertical blows that splintered the neck. In others the features were reworked, the jaw squared and the breasts reduced until the figure read as a man. The types of breaks differ from accidental collapse. Breaks run along the joints that were easiest to pry apart, suggesting that pieces were removed and carried off rather than simply toppled. Why choose hammer and chisel instead of leaving things to weather? The geography of damage gives away coordination. Monuments at Karnak and at Hatshepsut's own mortuary complex both bear the same selective erasures. Statues that once stood publicly were later found in pits or foundations, intentionally buried. Some fragments show secondary dressing, flaking and smoothing on fresh surfaces, then a layer of mortar or later stone laid over them. That tells a second story. Those who erased her did not only deface, they hid. Why bury what they had destroyed, instead of leaving it as a visible warning? Forensic eyes add another layer. Microscopic study of chisel marks separates older tool work from more recent damage. A weathered incision will have a soft, pitted surface. A fresh cut has sharp, glassy edges. Where names were removed long after original carving, the inner stone shows less patina and cleaner strike patterns. Chemical tests on residues reveal traces of pigments under the damaged areas, proving that some images were still painted when they were attacked. One statue still bears old red traces around a removed cartouche. The paint outlived the name for a short time. That forces a question about timing. Did the campaign follow political impulse at once, or did it unfold in stages over years? The selection of targets points to motive more than vandalism. Royal cartouches were prioritized. Temple scenes of gods, family or daily life were often spared. In certain places, whole registers were left intact while the few rows that named the queen were excised. That selective pattern reads like a deliberate assault on legitimacy. Eliminate the name and the memory of rule, but leave religious continuity untouched so the state can function. Yet the burials complicate the narrative. Why hide the removed pieces in foundation deposits that would only be opened by future builders? Was the goal total annihilation or careful erasure that kept the stones available for reuse, insulating the act from public spectacle? Some images were flattened and recarved into other kings. Faces were reshaped and new crowns incised, sometimes crudely, onto existing forms. Where recarving could not change sex, the sculptors chose to attack identity. Beards carried, breasts hacked away, cartouches erased. The physical evidence of these corrections is unmistakable. Tool strokes continue over earlier lines, and beneath the new names an older imprint persists if you look closely. This layering of identities asks another question. Was the erasure intended to replace Hatshepsut's memory with another ruler's, or simply to confuse and collapse her legacy into the general royal past? Finally, the way the destroyed pieces were treated after damage deepens the mystery. Many smashed statues were not discarded on the surface but stowed in pits, embedded in later wall cores, or used as packing. Builders often turn marked stones face down, hiding chips of the original carving. These practices kept the evidence, intentionally or not, within the archaeological record where modern eyes could reconstruct the campaign. That fact raises a last, practical question. Who carried out the erasure, and how centralized was the operation? A palace decree executed by state artisans, or a series of local decisions unified by a single political aim? The chisel marks supply the motion. They also demand an author. Not rage, something colder. The erasure was not emotional vandalism. It was selective, strategic, and incomplete in ways that reveal its true purpose. Not to punish Hatshepsut personally, but to restore the unbroken male line of succession from Thutmose I to Thutmose III, removing the theological anomaly of a female pharaoh from the official record, so the dynasty's legitimacy would appear seamless. Hammers and chisels struck the carved lines of royal names on temple walls, and with each deliberate cut a public record was being rewritten. The damage was not random fury. It followed patterns that archaeologists can still read. Cartouches smoothed to blanks, faces of statues hacked away, and inscriptions that once announced a woman's reign reduced to silence. The central injustice is plain. A ruler who held the full power and titulary of a king was systematically removed from the visible ledger that linked one sovereign to the next, so that the succession could read as uninterrupted and male. Look closely at the scars and you see logic, not rage. Attackers aimed first at the language and symbols that defined kingship. The royal name rings, the throne and praenomen, the places where kingship was ritually invoked. In temple courts and on processional walls, the spaces where priests recited lists, offered libations, and taught the story of royal descent. The edits are concentrated. Elsewhere, where the political story mattered less or the stone could not be easily altered, Images and monuments were often left alone or only partially touched. That selectivity shows the motive. Erase the theological anomaly of a female sovereign in precisely those places where the sequence of male rulers was preserved for cult and state memory. Concrete traces prove this was a political operation handled like a bureau would handle an awkward file. You can still find chisel marks around cartouches where names were carefully removed. In other spots, an inscription was left but its royal epithets were clipped or overwritten. Some statues were defaced just enough to disrupt identification, while massive features, obelisks, entire building facades, were spared or only lightly altered, because destroying them would have been impractical or sacrilegious. The effect is surgical. Remove the link in the official chain without provoking a cultural rupture that might destabilize temple economies or popular cult practice. Who planned that surgery and who signed the orders? The incompleteness of the erasure becomes its own evidence. Private tombs, administrative documents, and even certain temple niches retained references to her reign. Later generations, palace scribes and stoneworkers left clues the erasers could not fully erase. That patchwork survival shows that the goal was not simple obliteration of a person, but the reconfiguration of legitimacy. To present Thutmose I followed immediately by Thutmose III, with no theological detour into female kingship. If a straightforward act of vengeance had been intended, the record would be chaotic and total. Instead, it reads like a carefully drafted political brief. Which institutions kept these edits on the books, and which people resisted leaving any trace at all? Finally, the pattern asks a wider question about power. When rulers control memory, they do so by controlling the public places where memory is formalized. Temples, king lists, and cult inscriptions are the instruments of that control. And the campaign against this queen demonstrates that memory can be rewritten without total destruction. The attempt to make the dynasty read as a seamless line of men exposes the priority. Not personal punishment but dynastic theology. Yet the surviving fragments and contradictory wounds on the monuments also reveal the limits of such control. Who ultimately bore the responsibility for choosing what to erase, and why did they believe a smooth cartouche could remake the past? What the 19th century did to her memory. When European Egyptologists rediscovered Hatshepsut in the 1800s, they could not process a female pharaoh without filtering her through Victorian assumptions. She became a scheming stepmother, a usurper, an ambitious woman who stole her stepson's throne. And this chapter traces how modern scholarship inherited and amplified distortions that even the ancient erasers hadn't fully achieved. During the 19th century, a different kind of erasure took place. Scholars and the public confronted a royal name carved on stone that did not fit their assumptions, and they turned that mismatch into crisis. The central injustice was simple and brutal. Hatshepsut, who ruled with the public trappings of a king, was reframed by Victorian minds as an anomaly to be explained away. Instead of reading a set of titles, regalia, and ritual acts as proof of lawful rule, many commentators layered a story of intrigue and theft on top of the fragmentary evidence. How did a careful practice of reading monuments become a license to rewrite a life? Decipherment of hieroglyphs made her readable, and that readability exposed a problem for 19th century interpreters steeped in rigid gender expectations. Excavation reports, newspaper articles, and museum labels translated delicate nuances into blunt judgments. Female rulership equaled deception. Concrete choices reveal the mechanism. Print runs reproduced line drawings that emphasized the ceremonial beard and masculine dress on Hatshepsut statues, treating them as evidence of disguise rather than as conventional royal iconography. Museum captions condensed ambiguous repair marks and chisel scars into dramatic verdicts. Usurper, pretender. Early collectors removed sculptures and fragments from temple context and shipped them into glass cases in Europe. Once separated from their relief sequences and inscriptions, those fragments could be read as scandalous tokens rather than as parts of a coherent royal program. Who gave those interpreters the authority to turn technical description into character assassination? The next mechanism was amplification by narrative hunger. Travelogues and popular histories loved villains, and Hatshepsut fit the mold that Victorian storytellers favored. An ambitious stepmother who allegedly seized a young heir's throne. That image fed back into the academy. When specialists later considered the erasures of her names and images, they often assumed personal animus and violent removal rather than the more complex political calculus the evidence suggests. Scholars describe the chisel marks as acts of revenge, while the surviving inscriptions, building lists, expedition accounts, and priestly formulas, were read as evidence of illegitimate ambition. But the primary records show her exercising the formal powers of kingship and acting through official institutions. Why did stories of personal treachery become the explanatory shortcut? A single vivid omission shows how memory was reshaped. Entire wall scenes at a mortuary temple were damaged and later copied by European artists as picturesque ruins. Those romantic engravings circulated widely and fed a public imagination that preferred drama to detail. Meanwhile, detailed inscriptional evidence, trade missions, temple dedications, and formal titulary often sat unread or sidelined because it undercut the dramatic narrative. Professional reputations were at stake too. Repeating a sensational claim gained attention in journals and popular presses, while careful, less sensational analysis took years to surface. Which is stronger? The survival of stone or the power of an appealing story to bury it? Even the supposedly objective work of mapping and cataloging monuments carried value judgments that hardened into long-lived myths. Early catalog entries and guidebooks framed Hatshepsut's building projects as suspicious anomalies, attributing later damage to a jealous successor's purge and filling gaps with speculation about motive. Later textbooks, and then films and novels, inherited that shorthand and layered new embellishments on old guesses. The result is not simply an ancient erasure multiplied, but a modern reconstruction that often does more to obscure than to clarify. If memory can be manufactured in a museum label or a newspaper column, what would it take to dislodge a story that has been polished for more than a century? The mummy in the wrong tomb. For over a century, Hatshepsut's body was lost, until in 2007 a mummy found in a minor tomb, KV60, was identified through a broken tooth matching her canopic jar. And this chapter uses the forensic identification to show how even her physical remains were displaced, demoted, and stripped of royal context. They opened a cramped shaft and found a wrapped woman lying in the dark, her linen swollen with time and her remains without a crown. The sight was a sudden collapse of expectation. How could a ruler who once commanded temples and quarries end up in a narrow corridor with no throne, no funerary boat, no royal cartouche? That mismatch. A queen whose image had once filled stone faces, now reduced to anonymous bandages, became the central outrage. Her body had been moved, hidden, and finally forgotten. The discovery in that small tomb turned what had been a political erasure into a forensic puzzle. The place that held her was a tomb the guidebooks barely mentioned. KV60, a modest rock-cut chamber in the Valley of the Kings, home to 2 female burials and no grand inscriptions. When Egyptologists compared the remains with a canopic jar carried in a museum collection, a jar inscribed with the throne name Motker, a detail emerged that changed everything. Inside that jar lay a small fragment of a tooth. Radiographs of the mummified skull showed a matching gap. The broken tooth from the jar fit the empty socket in the mummy like a key in a lock. The match was announced and the reaction split the field. Some called it definitive, others asked for more testing. How certain can certainty be when a piece of a person has been separated from the rest of her life? That separation is itself a story of power. Royal funerary equipment was meant to work as a system. Coffin, mummy, canopic jars, funerary texts, and temple cults. In this case the system had been dismantled. Her canopic jar was not with her body but catalogued elsewhere. Her sarcophagus and statues had been smashed or reinscribed. Her name was chipped from monuments. Those are visible acts of removal that point to an organized campaign, not a simple theft or accident. If rulers could order their predecessors' images struck down, they could also order the body buried out of sight. Who had the authority to reduce a pharaoh to anonymity, and what did they hope to gain by hiding the corpse? The forensic identification did more than put a label on a wrapped body. It turned an act of political violence into traceable evidence. A broken tooth, a jar with a throne name, 10th-ray plates showing a match. That hard proof confronted the myth that a great ruler's end would be obvious in stone. Instead, the remains were relegated to a secondary space in catalog cards. But finding the body does not automatically restore the rituals, inscriptions, or status that were stripped away. Is a match tooth enough to reclaim the life and power that were deliberately dismantled? Or does the absence of a decorated coffin and cult mean the erasure continues in a different form? Even after the announcement, new questions kept opening. If the body was hidden and the jars dispersed, where did the rest of the royal apparatus go? Can archaeological fragments reconstruct a funerary program that was actively sabotaged? And finally, what does the physical dislocation of a ruler teach us about memory itself? About who gets to decide which names are carved in stone and which are left to darkness? The search for answers turned a single forensic fit into a larger inquiry about how power reaches into death and keeps rewriting history. The price of the comfortable version. The version of Hatshepsut that survived in popular culture. The woman who dressed as a man, the ambitious stepmother, the curiosity, is itself a form of erasure, because it reduces a 20-year reign of political, economic, and theological achievement to a gender riddle. And this chapter dissects exactly what is lost when complexity is replaced by anecdote. A single stroke of a chisel across a carved cartouche can change how a ruler is remembered. In the stone halls at Deir el-Bahari, faces were hacked, names smoothed flat, and a painted beard was cut away until only blank rock told the later story. That act of physical erasure set the stage for a different, quieter removal. A tidy narrative that turns a complex reign into a riddle about clothing and motive. The central distortion is simple. The long, active rule that organized fleets, built temples, and negotiated priestly power becomes, in popular memory, a story about a woman who put on male dress and seized a throne. There is truth in some of the small details that fuel the myth. Several statues and reliefs show her with a false beard, the Nemes headdress, and the royal regalia normally reserved for kings. But those images are not costume drama. They are deliberate acts of political language carved in stone. Tactics meant to make a contested authority legible to priests, officials, and foreign courts. The same monuments that present an androgynous figure also record the Punt expedition. Ships laden with incense trees, crews unloading exotic goods, and scenes of tribute that filled temple treasuries. When attention stays fixed on the beard, what do we lose of the message carried by those ships and storerooms? One mechanism of forgetting is substitution. Later rulers removed names and scenes, and later storytellers filled the blanks with gossip. Egyptian officials chiseled away cartouches and recarved titulary according to the next regime's needs. Centuries after that, European writers and early historians, confronting the visual oddities and the surviving mutilations, reached for simple explanations. Ambition, disguise, impropriety, rather than wrestling with administrative records or the architecture of power. The effect was cumulative. Stone was erased, and so were the institutional traces that might have explained how she commanded labor, held priestly alliances, and directed state rituals. If the physical record has been censored, why has the interpretive habit of simplifying survived? Reducing a two-decade reign to a gender puzzle also obscures concrete achievements and the mechanisms behind them. The temple terraces at Deir el-Bahari are not just grand art. They reorganized the cult landscape and redirected resources toward a new center of royal theology. The obelisks raised at Karnak were more than monuments. They were instruments in a verbal and visual contract with the god Amun and the priesthood who mediated power. The trade mission to Punt replenished aromatic resins that mattered for funerary rites and temple economies. These were administrative choices and long-term strategies, not incidental props in a scandal. If scholars and the public keep treating her as an anomaly, who will confront the archival and architectural traces that explain how a ruler actually governed? What Thutmose III could not erase. Despite the campaign, Hatshepsut's obelisks still stand at Karnak. Her temple at Deir el-Bahari still dominates the western bank, and fragments of her reign survived in enough places that the erasure itself became evidence, proving that the scale of what had to be destroyed was the strongest testimony to the scale of what she built. They came like an emergency crew sent to erase a disaster. Teams with chisels, hammers, and ropes moving through temples to wipe a ruler from stone. The crisis was deliberate and public. Official erasure intended to make Hatshepsut vanish from the record. Names were hacked out of cartouches, priestly scenes were altered, and dozens of statues were defaced or decapitated. That was the central injustice. A state-sponsored program to shrink a reign so completely that later generations would not know it had existed. How complete could such a campaign be, when every cut left fresh evidence of its own violence? Her obelisks at Karnak tell the next part of the story, carved from Aswan granite, hauled up the Nile, and raised inside the great precinct of Ammonius. Those slender monuments were not easy to touch without leaving evidence. Even where chisels struck at royal names, the sheer presence of the obelisks, the work of massive logistics and planning, could not be erased. One still thrusts skyward in the temple complex, its polished faces bearing the rhythm of carved texts and the scars of later attacks. Why remove a name from a shaft of stone that everyone could see and count, when the monument itself already testified to a ruler's will and resources? The mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari offers a harsher proof. The terraces, colonnades, and chapels Hatshepsut built into the cliffside dominate the western bank. You cannot take out a temple by smoothing a few cartouches. Workers struck faces and chiseled cartouches to change genders, but whole walls of reliefs remained. Sun, wind, and later hands left original scenes partly readable. Broken statues were tossed aside, and some blocks were taken to be reused in other projects, which spread pieces of her reign across the landscape. Those dispersals create their own trail. Who ordered selective hits, and why did teams stop at certain walls, leaving others intact? In the end, the attempt to obliterate became its own proof. The pattern of damage, where names were removed, where faces were smashed, where reliefs were left untouched, maps the intensity and reach of Hatshepsut's program. Tool marks, half-erased cartouches, and displaced blocks recovered from temple foundations show that destroying her record would have required more manpower and time than simply producing the monuments in the first place. The scale of what had to be destroyed acts like a tally of what had once existed. If erasure leaves this much debris and contradiction, who truly controls a ruler's reputation? Those who try to erase it, or the stones and the people who keep finding the pieces? The machine that runs on forgetting, Hatshepsut's story is not unique. It is a template, a mechanism by which a woman exercises full, legitimate, effective power, and then the system that allowed her is retroactively edited to make her either invisible, monstrous, or trivial. And this chapter names that mechanism plainly so the viewer sees it not as ancient history but as a recurring structure. Stone dust filled the air as chisels bit into a queen's face and a hammer rang hollow against dressed limestone. The act was swift, repeated, and irreversible. Faces were scraped flat, names were cut out of cartouches, phrases that praised her reign were hammered away until only ragged seams remained. What was once a public record of rulership? Reliefs showing a ruler sending ships to Punt, obelisks raised in temple courts, statues wearing the royal beard and nemes, was made to look as if it had never honored her at all. The central injustice is simple and brutal. A woman who held full royal power was not merely forgotten by chance. The historical record was deliberately edited to erase her authority. That deliberate editing worked through ordinary, physical tools and ordinary bureaucratic habits. Sculptors recarved faces or removed them completely. Priests and scribes painted over and replaced cartouches in temple inscriptions. King lists and official chronicles left holes where her name had been, or listed her as a brief anomaly rather than a sovereign. Monuments she commissioned were reattributed or left anonymous. Concrete examples survive. The mortuary temple on its cliff face preserves vivid scenes of her building projects and the celebrated expedition to Punt. Yet many of those same scenes show later interventions where her image is defaced. Statues capture her wearing male regalia, the false ceremonial beard and kilt, and later hands smoothed away feminine features. Those are not metaphors. They are chiseled stone, weathered paint, and inked-out names in administrative roles. How do you dismantle a ruler's memory? You touch every surface where memory lives. The motivations behind the erasure are not a single whisper, but a set of practical moves that form a pattern. Removing a name from a king list changes legal memory. Subsequent officials, priests, and foreign courts consult those lists when tracing entitlement to land, temple stipends, and ritual duties. Chiseling an image from a temple disincentivizes homage and redirects the gaze of the populace. Recasting statues to appear male redefines the acceptable image of authority for future generations. These acts serve political ends in plain bureaucratic language. They reassign legitimacy, redistribute resources, and tidy the narrative for those who come after. Evidence points to coordinated campaigns. The damage is systematic, focused on royal insignia and titulary rather than random vandalism. Who benefits when a powerful tenure is turned into an omission? Calling this mechanism by name helps the outline come into focus. It is institutional erasure, a machine that grinds away presence through removal, reattribution, and silence. It operates on 3 practical levels at once: the material stone and statue, the textual lists and inscriptions, and the ceremonial ritual recognition and titles. Each level reinforces the others. A king list that omits a ruler discourages priests from offering rituals in her name. A temple where her image has been scrubbed discourages public memory. A lack of ritual support undermines legal claims. In Hatshepsut's case, the machine left a clear architecture. Abundant surviving works that proclaim her agency alongside deliberate blanks where her name and likeness once stood. What, then, remains as evidence when the machine has done its work? And how do we read the spaces it leaves? We can separate myth from evidence by watching how the erasure was executed rather than betting on imagined motives. Myths present Hatshepsut as a usurper or as a monstrous anomaly. The stones suggest a more mundane reality. She adopted conventional symbols of kingship and ran the state apparatus effectively, and later administrators chose to reframe the line of succession. The record of construction, the logistics of quarrying and shipping, the administrative lists replete with officials acting on her authority. These are hard traces of governance that do not vanish simply because a cartouche is removed. Yet the machine's success is measured in its durability. For centuries later, readers encountered official lists and temple courts that made her absence seem natural. If forgetting can be manufactured, then remembering becomes a reconstruction. Who will be entrusted with that reconstruction? And whose perspective will it favor? She was not an exception, she was a pharaoh. The final chapter does not eulogize Hatshepsut but reframes the entire video. The question was never whether she was remarkable enough to rule, but why so much effort, ancient and modern, was required to make the world forget that she did. A mason's chisel bites stone, and the face of a ruler is gone. In a single act of violence against rock and memory, the smooth cheek and carved eyes of a royal statue are roughened into anonymity. That moment of irreversible damage, the visible whisper of someone trying to make a name disappear, is where the story of Hatshepsut's erasure becomes a crisis, not just an episode. The central injustice is blunt. Public monuments, inscriptions, and images that announced her power were deliberately altered, names hacked away, and male features imposed on a woman who had ruled as pharaoh. This was not accidental wear. The marks are purposeful, repeated, and targeted at places designed to be seen by generations. Look at the stones themselves and you see the mechanism. Walls at the mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari show carved panels where her cartouche was sliced out, and the surrounding plaster recut. Statues that once portrayed a woman in royal garb were given the false beard of kingship, then later broken at the neck or head. Obelisks and temple inscriptions that broadcasted building programs and offerings were left with jagged gaps where her name had been. These physical details explain the world differently. Political power in ancient Egypt flowed through what could be seen and read by the public. Control of monuments was control of the story of who had the right to rule. The question shifts from whether she could rule to why rivals felt they had to erase the proof that she did. Why destroy evidence rather than simply counter it with propaganda? The answer lies in fear of reputation and the machinery that enforces it. Memory was legitimacy. Priests, scribes, and subsequent kings managed the narrative by keeping, altering, or removing inscriptions. When a successor wanted to present himself as the rightful heir, removing a predecessor's name was an act of lawmaking with a steady hammer and chisel. Yet the erasure was uneven. Some statues remained intact in out-of-the-way places, and her temple endured structurally even where names were gouged. That selective approach raises a new question. Was the campaign about eliminating one woman, or about the precedent she represented? That rulership could be claimed outside the usual male line, and so required targeted, symbolic destruction to reassure the living and the dead? Modern actors joined the ancient effort, although in quieter ways. Early excavations and museum displays